Welcome to the Published Author Podcast, where we help entrepreneurs learn how to write a book and leverage it to grow their business and make an impact. I'm your host, Josh Steimle. Today, our guest is Rob Tighe. He has worked with words for 18 years, initially as an award-winning journalist, and more recently as a copywriter, storyteller, and #1 best-selling ghostwriter. Previously, Rob was the country editor for the Red Bulletin, which is Red Bull's global adventure lifestyle magazine. And he was also an award-winning freelance journalist for various newspapers and magazines, including ESPN.com, Metro, New Zealand Geographic, Sky Sport, the magazine, Herald on Sunday, and the Sunday Star Times. In 2015, Rob wrote 0 to 60, The Life and Times of Tony Quinn, a Scottish-Australian entrepreneur who made his fortune selling pet food and invested some of his millions in building a world-class racetrack in New Zealand. The book went to #1 on the New Zealand nonfiction bestsellers list. And Rob is currently working on 3 other books for New Zealand entrepreneurs. You might be able to guess where he's living right now, which is New Zealand. In 2018, Rob founded Storybud to help business leaders find and tell better stories. And although Rob's in New Zealand, he's originally from Ireland. He moved to New Zealand in 2004, where he lives with his family, and he enjoys long-distance trail races, which leads into my first question. But first, welcome, Rob. Thank you for being here.
Cheers, Josh. Thanks for having me.
So my first question is, which you can tell I'm eager to ask, is what are your favorite trail running shoes?
I use a UK brand called Innovate, Josh, and they are fantastic. I found them a few years ago, and they just work really, really well. They're no nonsense, no frills, but yeah, they're great shoes.
All right, I'll have to try those out. I got into trail running a few years back, and I wrote for Asia Trail magazine while I was living in Hong Kong and China. And so they gave me tons of trail running shoes to try out. I never tried out that brand, but I tried out every single other brand, it seemed like, of trail running shoe. And I love Ultras. I just can't live without my Ultras. They're the #1 trail running shoe for me. So
excellent.
So what's the longest distance that you've run?
About 3 weeks ago, Josh, I ran a 50K, so 50 kilometers down in Lake Taupo, which is in the middle of the North Island of New Zealand. So yeah, that was an epic day out on just perfect trail running conditions. It was really dry, really soft, springy trails. And yeah, I survived. I got around and suffered a bit in the last 15 kilometers or so. But man, what a feeling. As you know from running trail, that feeling you get when you go through the pain barrier and get to the finish line, it's pretty special.
It is great. And I bet there's some beautiful trail running in New Zealand.
Yeah, we're lucky. We are spoiled for choice for sure. I mean, it's taken me to some beautiful parts of New Zealand. Obviously, I live in Auckland in the North Island, but last year I went down to Queenstown in the South Island for just a spectacular mountain marathon called the Shot Over Moonlight Marathon, which again, if anybody is interested in trail running, that's another epic race down in the South Island of New Zealand.
All right. We could talk about trail running the rest of the day here, but we got to get on to book stuff, right? So I want to ask this question first off about ghostwriting, because that's what we'll be focusing on primarily here today. What are some of the misconceptions people have about ghostwriters or the ghostwriting process when it comes to books?
I guess there's 2 types of ghostwriters, I guess. There's maybe the ghostwriter who does 99% of the writing and comes up with all the ideas and basically takes over the project. I'm the other type of ghostwriter who basically interviews the people I work with and draws the stories out of them. So I mean, for me, the key is to try and capture the voice of the person you're working with. So it doesn't read like my book, that it reads like the client's book. And capturing that voice, I think, is one of the biggest challenges of ghostwriting. I would say that you have to be able to adapt your writing to capture the voice of the person you're working with on that particular book, right?
Great. So with that as context, take us back a little bit and tell us your backstory. Where did you come from? Where did you grow up? How did you become a writer? Tell us a little bit more about your history and how you got from there to this point of where you're ghostwriting executives' books today.
Yeah. Well, as you said in the intro, I'm from Ireland originally, from a small town in the west of Ireland, where I grew up on a dairy farm, and so milking cows and playing football and reading heaps took up, I suppose, most of my time when I was younger. Reading, I suppose, was obviously crucial to what I do now, and obviously I read stuff like Roald Dahl and Stephen King and those kind of characters. But probably my biggest influence was newspapers and sports writers and sports journalists in particular. I just devoured that stuff. I mean, it was the golden age of newspapers. I remember we used to get like the daily paper religiously. We used to get a local paper, a regional paper, and then every Sunday my dad would go out and get 3 Sunday newspapers, and that's how he spent wet Sunday mornings in Ireland, was just reading the newspaper from cover to cover. And then I remember when I was like 13 or 14, my mum gave me a typewriter with a manual on that taught me how to touch type. I think she may have seen something that I didn't at that time, and that was just such a boon, really, to get that kind of experience behind me and to start typing at that age.
So how old were you again when you started typing?
I think I was 13 or 14. So I mean, I wasn't the most diligent student, but I think she saw that I had potential to be a writer, and that type and giving me this typewriter was her way of kind of showing, here's a little hint for you, without a push. It was just a little hint, and it was enough, and it was a really, really great present. And from there, that kind of motivated me. I contacted the editor of the local newspaper, got a summer job, and kind of had my heart set on journalism. And then I went to university where I studied English and sociology and politics. And I kind of got sidetracked, Josh. I kind of came to associate writing with boring academic essays and exams and pressure. And it put me off to an extent, and it put me off for a few years, actually. I took a swerve and went down the corporate road and worked in insurance and sales and recruitment. I worked in the recruitment industry for a few years. But I think all the while during my 20s, there was this nagging voice in the back of my head saying, come on, you know what you want to do. You should be a writer. So eventually, I think I was 28 when I walked into a bookshop and I picked up a book by Tony Robbins. Now, I would have been a total self-help skeptic up to that point, but for some reason, that book just spoke to me that day. And I took it home and I went through it and I did the exercises, and kind of the message with any of those self-help books is, you get to live your life by choice, not by chance. So you've got to make decisions to make things happen. And that really was the turning point for me. I kind of wrote down my goal that I wanted to become a journalist, that I wanted to become a sports writer. I went back to my hometown. I had been living in Dublin, and I went back to my hometown and begged the editor to give me any job he could in the paper. And so he gave me a start as a sports reporter. And 20 years later, I'm still writing. I suppose that role gave me, a taste of journalism. And from there, I got more experience under my belt. I came to New Zealand in 2004, and I pretty much started from the bottom, Josh. I had to write, I remember writing advertorials for like barbecue restaurants and furniture stores, and doing some really soul destroying work. But again, it was great grounding, and particularly we might talk about this later, what I do now where I write for businesses, it was just a great grounding in that kind of writing. But gradually I got more experience. I started freelancing. I started working for better magazines and newspapers. And then I got a big break around 2010 when I got a job with Red Bull, editing their country magazine called the Red Bulletin. And that was just a fantastic opportunity to I interviewed their extreme athletes. I interviewed musicians. I interviewed business people, entrepreneurs, kind of across the board, really. And just some really inspiring people that were just great kind of raw material for feature stories.
That sounds like a pretty exciting gig.
It was cool. And the thing was, it was a real eye opener for me in terms of working with those people. I think a lot of people, when you think of Red Bull and extreme athletes, and I think you were into skateboarding, but a lot of people maybe associate extreme athletes with, just give it a go, or just, chuck it off a ramp and see what happens. But it's the complete opposite. Though the guys that I met through Red Bull were just the most thoughtful and considered and motivated people, you could imagine. I mean, these guys are like entrepreneurs themselves, right? Because they have to market themselves. They have to set goals for themselves. They have to set targets. They have to market themselves. They're just phenomenal, and working with those guys and interviewing those guys really opened a lot of doors for me, including the opportunity to write my first book, which came out of a magazine profile I did on Tony Quinn, a guy who had kind of come, he got some kind of press in New Zealand for this racetrack that he built in a small town in Cromwell in central Otago. Now Cromwell is a quiet, sleepy kind of a town. It's an orchard town with some vineyards, but not a lot happened in Cromwell. And Tony came along and spent like $30 million on building like a world-class motorsport track in this just beautiful, picturesque setting in the South Island of New Zealand. So I went down to see the racetrack and see this man who built the racetrack and hung out with him for the weekend. And it was just an incredible story. He had come from nothing really in Scotland, moved to Australia, got involved in the pet food industry and built his brand up to be the leading brand in Australia. And just before he invested the money in the racetrack, he sold his company for like $400 million or something like that. So just a great rags to riches story. And Tony was also just a gifted storyteller. He had the real gift of the gab. And during the course of the weekend, he told me that he was trying to write a book. He was determined to write his life story, but he had already fired 2 writers. So that should have set some alarm bells ringing in my head, but
yeah, it seems like kind of a red flag there.
Yeah, a little bit, right? But he explained the reason and the rationale. He just said that the guys, the writers he worked with, just didn't quite get it. They weren't capturing his voice. They had sent him some samples, and it wasn't quite what he wanted. And he's Scottish, I'm Irish, and we just clicked that weekend. And so, I mean, I'd never really considered writing a book up to that point, Josh. But again, it was just one of those moments. I finished the magazine profile on him, and I emailed it to him and to his personal assistant. And I just added a PS at the end of the email. I said, listen, you told me about writing a book one day. I'd love to have a crack at it if you're keen to chat about it. And that one PS led to working with Tony on his book, led to a #1 bestseller, and it led to what I'm doing now in terms of working with other entrepreneurs and other businesses. So, yeah, it was definitely the most important PS of my life, I would say, Josh.
That's great. So, what did the process look like of getting this book out of Tony's head? Did you do a lot of in-person meetings, phone, Zoom?
Yeah.
What did that look like?
Yeah, he, as I said, was a really good storyteller, but in terms of capturing the story, I sat down with him kind of once a week or twice a week for about 2 to 3 hours. And I just asked him a couple of questions and let him talk, really. I mean, at that stage, I very much wanted him to kind of zero in on the key turning points in his life. I didn't interrupt too much at that stage. I let it flow, and it was the best thing I could have done, because he had a lot of stories to tell, and I suppose those stories kind of formed the edges, if you like, of the jigsaw puzzle. I mean, that's the kind of way I look at a book. Certainly, a ghostwriting project is you've got to kind of piece the puzzle together, and by letting the client kind of talk freely at the beginning, they give you a really good outline of what their life looks like, and so after that first initial kind of brain dump, if you like, from Tony, then it was a question of really mining and digging deep for the details that make any book or that make a story. And that was, that process also involved talking to lots of people around him, including his family, people who worked in the business with him, people he raced against in his motorsport side of things. And then it was just at the end, obviously, it was a process of putting the puzzle together, which I know you've been there, you've written a few books. That is, the most challenging and also the most rewarding part of the process, I think, right?
Yep. So how much time do you think you spent with interviewing Tony focused on just him? And then how much time do you think you spent doing research with other people?
I would say with Tony, it was probably over probably a 4-month period, 3 hours, a couple of times a week. So maybe 70 hours, 60, 70 hours, something like that. Interviewing other people, probably 20 to 30 hours, I would say. So somewhere around there, Josh, I would say. I mean, he had a hell of a story to tell. So yeah, there was a lot of interviews to do and a lot of detail to drag out of him. But yeah, roughly around that.
So when people think that, oh, I'm just going to hire a ghostwriter and then they'll just write the book and it's going to be easy, this was still a substantial amount of time for Tony, this successful entrepreneur, to invest in this, right?
Yeah, correct. I mean, and again, listen, it depends on the level of detail you want to go into. You know, there are different types of book. I wrote an ebook last year for an entrepreneur who was involved in business strategy, and that was much more focused on her business and her professional career. And that probably was closer to 20 hours or 25 hours. But Tony saw this very much as a legacy project. So, I mean, for him, it was something that he wanted to do properly. I mean, he told me that one of the main motivations for getting his story down on paper was that he had a grandfather who had this incredible story of being involved in kind of revolutions in Ireland and going to the States and on a boat and coming back paralyzed and learning to walk again. This incredible story of his grandfather that he heard secondhand, and it was never written down on paper. And so for Tony, that was the main motivation, to leave this legacy behind. So as a result, he was determined to go into a lot of detail and really capture his story. So, I mean, I think Tony's book ended up being 80,000, 90,000 words. So for other entrepreneurs, you can do, as you know, you can do shorter books, 30,000 words, 40,000 words. Is perfectly adequate for some books as well, but this was a legacy for Tony.
Now, who did Tony expect to be the audience for this book? Who is he trying to reach?
Yeah, I guess unlike some entrepreneurs and business people who write a book, Tony didn't need to use it as a promotional tool. I mean, he wasn't looking to get on the speaking circuit. He wasn't looking to use it to promote his business. It was purely a legacy for him and his family, or so he thought. And then as we worked on the book, I was talking to him and saying, listen, this story is inspirational. You've got to get this book out there. There's a market for this book. Obviously, he was heavily involved in motorsport. He was, as well as building this racetrack, he was also an accomplished and very successful race driver himself in Australia and New Zealand. So he had a large kind of network in that community that would have been interested in it. And he also had a really good profile in Australia and New Zealand in terms of the business community for what he did, because he had built this business. He had bought and sold some other high profile businesses in Australia as well. So it ended up, as I say, being much more than just a legacy project. The target market was the motorsport communities in Australia and New Zealand, and business communities, and a lot of people bought it because it was just such a great read as well, right?
Mm-hmm. So, having written this book for Tony, this was the first book that you ever wrote, correct?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
So what was that transition like, going from writing articles, working for Red Bull and these publications where it was shorter form writing, to writing this very long piece?
Yeah, it was daunting, I'll be honest. There's definitely times during a book writing process where you think, how am I going to make this work? How am I going to pull all the strands together? But I did treat it as very much kind of, and I've said this to other people before, taking each chapter on its own merits and writing it almost as a mini kind of feature article or profile, and approaching it that way. I mean, for me, the key thing was to capture Tony's voice, and to do that. I mean, I transcribed every interview word for word, and I kept a really close ear out for the way he talked and the phrases he used, and I made sure that I kind of didn't change them too much, didn't edit them out. But at the same time, the key was kind of taking Tony's thoughts and ideas and making them coherent. As with a piece of journalism, you've got to make sure that every sentence, every paragraph flows into the next one. And an editor of mine once told me, make sure you answer every possible question that the reader might have. So that's what I tried to do. I tried not to get too bogged down in the enormity of the task, if you like. I just tried to take each chapter on its own merits and do as good a job as I could with each chapter. And then in the final kind of editing and polishing process, Joss, I really took time to make sure that each chapter segued nicely into the other chapter as well. That again was a key for me, to make sure that the whole thing flowed and was coherent.
So as you were finishing up this book, then where was the handoff? Did you manage the book all the way through the process? Did you help him with printing and typesetting and editing, or did you connect him with the right people or the right companies, or how involved were you?
No, I mean, I basically got it to a final draft stage. He was in a position where he already had a book deal with a publisher who, like me, had heard the stories of this racetrack being built in the middle of nowhere down in the South Island. So they had approached him and said, "Listen, we'd really like to publish a book about the racetrack." And I think their initial plan was that they wanted it to be more about the racetrack and about his motorsport career. But he convinced them that he wanted to tell his life story instead, and they were open to that. Once they read the final draft, they went all in, and they helped promote it. They got obviously designer on board and helped launch it around the country. So I basically took a step backwards at that stage. But I suppose one of the key things that Tony did was he was very actively involved in promoting it as well. He went on a nationwide tour around New Zealand with the book. So he contacted a lot of, again, his motorsport connections and held kind of events for the motorsport community in different parts of the country. Went to bookshops and signed copies and promoted it through bookshops. So he was very actively engaged in the promotion of it himself, which was great.
Cool. So then how did this lead to the other opportunities that you're working on right now? You're working with 3 other entrepreneurs on ghostwriting books for them. Did they find you because of Tony's book, or was it other connections?
Yeah, pretty much because of Tony's book. Yeah, they one of them was good friends with Tony, and again, like Tony, he had been intending to do this for a while. It's funny. There's 3 very different books, and the 3 books give a real insight into the challenges, if you like, of writing or ghostwriting for entrepreneurs and business people, because things can change so dramatically with business owners. And a book is very much a long game as well. Their business can change, in the course of writing the book. I mean, for example, the first one I did after Tony was for a construction company, and it was a family-owned business, and there was a father and 2 sons. And one of the sons approached me to try and again capture this family business and how they had built it from nothing and got it to a stage where it was a multi-million-dollar company in New Zealand. Over the course of the interviews and over the course of writing it, I think he realized that he wanted to take a step back from the business. So by the end of the process, he didn't need it as a promotional tool, which he originally intended. I think he intended for the book to be, a line in the sand about, this is our family business and this is how we built it and this is how we do things around here. But yeah, within, over the course of the 6 months or a year that we were writing it, he realized, I actually don't want to run this business anymore. And he handed it over to a general manager. So that book is finished, but it's sitting in his inbox, and he decided, right, he was glad to have done it, but it was like, okay, I've got it off my chest. I've been through that. And it was almost a cathartic process for him.
It was like therapy or something. And then once he was through it, he's like, you know what? I'm out of here.
Yeah, exactly right. Which was, I was surprised. Thankfully, I had invoiced throughout the process, which is a good tip for anybody thinking of writing a book. Make sure you work out a payment system in advance so that if something like that does happen, you're not left in the lurch, right? Because, that would have been an absolute disaster. The 2 other books, again, are at various stages of completion. Another of the guys I started working with, I think, realized halfway through the process that his memory wasn't as good as he thought it was. So he was trying to recall, details about his business dealings over the years, and about the highs and the lows. And he just really, really struggles to recapture the details that he needed to write a book. So again, that's kind of been put on hold for the moment because he just wasn't ready to go there, I think. And that's writing a book. It's a challenging process for the writer and the subject, right? Because you've got to dig deep into your past, and that's a challenging thing for a lot of people to do, right? And then the final book project, again, it's almost ready to be published. But just before we were kind of ready to press the green light, the guy ran into some challenges with his business. Then COVID came along and created some more challenges for his business. So he hasn't probably got the ending that he wanted. And again, that's an important part of a business book, or especially a memoir, is where do you end it? You obviously want to end on a high note. And so this guy decided, right, let's just press pause on this project as well and see where we're at. So he's a guy I've got to ring very shortly, actually, and see where his head is at. So yeah, it's an interesting process, kind of writing a book for an entrepreneur, for sure.
So do you feel like this is your career going forward, or do you feel like this is kind of a side thing that you're trying out for a little while, but you might go back to writing for publications, or what do you see your future being?
Yeah, listen, I love the process of writing a book. Obviously, again, like trail running, the sense of achievement at the end of writing a book is pretty damn special. To hold a physical book in your hand and know that you played a part in it is pretty fantastic. So yeah, I'm definitely always open to book opportunities, and I'm talking to some other entrepreneurs as well at the moment about projects with them. And so it's great. But originally, kind of after I wrote Tony's book, I did kind of contemplate setting up a business offering an A to Z type service. So, basically helping them ghostwrite the book, helping them publish it, helping them launch it. But the more I looked into that, the more I realized they're very different skill sets, in terms of publishing a book, dealing with the publishers in China or Hong Kong or wherever. Then there's so much detail involved in launching a book and promoting it. And I realized that it wasn't me, that I was more excited about the writing process and the interviewing process and drawing stories out of people than the publishing side of things. So since then, I kind of I've moved into a business model where I work with businesses and entrepreneurs on a kind of a distilled version of their book, which I call Your Origin Story, which again is a very similar process. It's interviewing entrepreneurs and business people about who they are, where they've come from, what they do, and why they do it, and then distilling that down into something they can use on their website as a presentation or a speech or as a video to explain who they are. And that's working really well, and it gives people, I guess, an insight into the process as well. If they're contemplating writing an ebook or a book, going through this kind of mini version of it is just a really good starter for them, and I'm really excited about that at the moment, Josh.
What were some of the lessons learned from writing Tony's book that you've been able to bring into the process as you're working with these other clients of yours?
Yeah, good question. One, I got a lot more organized. I mean, I think I did Tony's first one on Google Docs. So one of the first things I did when I finished Tony's book was research writing software, and I invested in Scrivener. I don't know if you've come across Scrivener. And that was fantastic, just in terms of getting more organized and making it much easier to kind of get an overview of the book and move things around and just pull the whole thing together. That was a really, really good investment, and figuring out that was really, really important. In terms of the process,
tell us a little bit more about the software there, because a lot of people do have questions about, do I use Word? Do I use Google Docs? Do I use Scrivener?
Yeah.
And I've used Scrivener before. I've used Word, obviously. I use Google Docs quite a bit. And I found that Scrivener, there's a bit of a learning curve there with getting to use it. But in your case, you feel like that was worth it. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just in terms of the usability and the ease of kind of being able to shift your view from chapter to chapter really, really quickly, to compare chapters side by side, do searches on phrases that reoccur regularly that maybe you need to, slightly tweak or change. I just found the having the layout as well, having all your chapters down the side and in the sidebar was just a really instinctive kind of way of doing it as well, and getting your head around the book and because it's a lot of text, right? And you've got to be able to manage it. And for me, Scrivener was a massive improvement on Google Docs, and it took a while to get my head around it, but definitely worth the investment and the time for sure. Cool.
So then, what were some of the other lessons learned from Tony's book that you've brought into your current process?
I think the important thing is to never not never, but you've got to draw on the line in the sand somewhere, but to keep asking questions, to keep probing for details. Sometimes that means asking the same question 3 or 4 times, sometimes it means rephrasing the question a different way. I would often revisit like the key pivotal turning points in his life. I would quite often revisit them, 3 or 4 times throughout the process. And every time you'd ask the question, you'd get a slightly different answer that would add more kind of nuance to it. It would add more detail to it. It would add more color to it. And again, that comes from, I guess, my journalism background. Is there's no such thing as a stupid question. And for me, I suppose I didn't come from a motorsport background, so I was very, very, it didn't bother me to ask questions that maybe a motorsport writer wouldn't have asked. So I was able to, again, just draw out a lot of detail from Tony that, other writers wouldn't. And I think that's key. Ask questions, ask lots of questions.
With this experience that you're getting under your belt, are you now tempted to write your own book?
Yeah, again, I don't know. It's not something that, a few years ago I would have ever thought I would have been interested in doing. But since I've started kind of working with the entrepreneurs and business people around telling their stories and helping them tell better stories, I've really gone deep into that side of things. And I'm kind of working through the process with those guys about, the art of storytelling and how it impacts people. That could be something that I'd be interested in sitting down one day and pulling together into a book, because it's fascinating. And I love that process of getting stories out of people, because, so many people say, I don't have any stories to tell. But yeah, we all have amazing stories to tell. It's just a matter of kind of taking the time to reflect on them and actually sitting down and thinking about the stories that have, influenced you and impacted you over the course of your life.
In Tony's book, was it just stories, or were there like lessons learned or call outs, or how did you organize that?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was mainly a chronological kind of telling of his life. Josh, I wouldn't say there was kind of divided into chapters that were kind of instructional as such. It wasn't a how-to manual of how he became successful in business. So I haven't done too many of those type of books that are kind of very much, this is how you do it. With Tony's book, it was very much at the arc of his life. But it was interesting as we kind of went through the process. The theme of the book emerged, and I know some writers are very much into kind of and advocate, identifying your theme quite early on and doing a lot of outlining. For me, and the way the book evolved with Tony, it was really organic. Through chatting with him, I realized that a lot of his kind of motivation and his inner drive came from wanting to prove his father wrong. He had grown up working with his dad, who was also involved in the pet food business. He worked really hard with his dad. He loved hard work, but he also saw that his dad worked really hard for not much financial gain. And he ran away from the pet food industry, but then later in life he got back involved in the pet food industry again. And I think over the course of the book, it emerged that a lot of his drive came from proving his father wrong, and that kind of was something that I zeroed in on in the book and kind of drew out a little bit from some of the stories we talked about, which was interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. How do you get people comfortable telling those stories? Or, I mean, in Tony's case, it sounded like he was just comfortable telling stories generally, but
Yeah.
How do you get somebody to really open up and share vulnerable, perhaps sensitive details about themselves?
Yeah, good question. It can be a slow process. Yeah, again, I think you have to be prepared sometimes to put in the time. And as I say, slowly draw out the information from them. I think sometimes you got to kind of hold off on the harder questions till later on, till you've established that sense of trust, and then build it up from there. But I like to think that I try to make it conversational rather than an interrogation. I think that's key. You've got to try and get a relaxed atmosphere during the interview, so that they are comfortable to share those stories. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, it is quite a process for people to dig into their past and to think about the important turning points in their life. So yeah, it's slowly. I think you got to gain their trust.
What advice would you give to an entrepreneur or an executive who's looking for a ghostwriter? What's the right way to hire a ghostwriter and hire the right ghostwriter?
To hire the right ghostwriter, yeah. I mean, I think there's got to be some kind of there's got to be the relationship has got to be good. You got to get a sense that this is a person you can spend time with. Sometimes you'll click with a ghostwriter, sometimes you won't. I mean, I've met some entrepreneurs and it hasn't worked out because for one reason or another, just the relationship isn't there. You've got to have a good gut feeling about the person you're gonna share your story with. You're gonna open up to this person. So that for me is one of the keys. You got to have that sense that the personality is going to be a good fit. Obviously, I think it does help if they've got some experience in your area of expertise as well. That definitely helps. But for me, that the priority is it's got to be a relationship that works. So I would be very much advocate that it has to be personality driven.
If there were somebody out there kind of like you a few years ago, maybe they're working in journalism or writing articles and they're thinking, hey, I might want to become a ghostwriter, what would you advise them knowing what you know now?
I think it's do good work. I mean, if you do good work for every publication you work for, I think automatically you'll start to get better and better opportunities. You've got to invest so much of yourself into each article, and never accept kind of second best when you're writing an article. Make sure it's the very best you can be. From there, it's really, I suppose, a case of keeping an eye out for opportunities and something that's a little bit different. I mean, Tony Quinn's story just jumped out at me, not as a book project, but just as just something totally unique and different. This guy building something in the middle of nowhere with his own money was just a story that was too good to turn down. I didn't chase the book opportunity, but I was open to it, I think, and that's key because just spotting those opportunities is a big part of it.
How do you handle billing? Is it hourly? Is it by the project? Because every engagement is different and you don't really know what you're getting into at the beginning of it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I tend to, again, base it on kind of those initial interviews with the client where I try and get a good feeling and a good sense for how much information or existing kind of research they can provide me with, how much of that I will have to do myself. Whether they themselves are good storytellers or whether I will have to end up writing a good chunk of it. You've got to weigh up all those things and decide with most of the books I've written, it's been a project price where I kind of work out and get a sense for how long I think it's going to take me. And then one or two of the other books I've written have been on an hourly basis because there was that uncertainty there. And I think you've got to weigh that up. It's a tricky process, Josh, for sure. Trying to price a ghostwriting project as how long is a piece of string, really. But just make sure during that kind of initial kind of getting to know each other stage that you get a really good sense of how much material you're going to get at the start of the project and how much digging you're going to have to do, because you've got to do a lot of digging, then it's going to take a lot of time.
Right. And no matter how many times you do this, every time you do it, it's a new project. It's not like an
Yeah.
assembly line of cars coming off of a tight process. This is like inventing a new car every single time.
Correct. Yeah, and again, that's one of the joys of it as well. I love that kind of the start of a project where you kind of just starting to get a feel for what this might look like, and and as you go through, it's almost like you're panning for gold. You kind of filtering through the pebbles and the stones to find the nuggets that will form the basis of your story. But yeah, absolutely, as you say, every time is a fresh start, which can be a challenge for some people. I love it. I love starting from scratch and getting to know somebody and drawing the story out of them.
Great. Well, Rob, are there any questions I should have asked that I haven't asked?
Ooh, I don't know. What have we not covered?
Anything you wanted to talk about that we haven't talked about yet?
I think one of the key parts of writing a book is kind of the final sprint to the finish line. For me, I took myself off for 2 weeks and dedicated 2 weeks to the book, solely to the book. I didn't look at any other email. I didn't look at any other parts of my business. I left my family for 2 weeks. They went off on holiday somewhere, and I got a house and just spent 2 weeks working from kind of 6 a.m. till 8 o'clock at night, just totally focused on that final edit process and making sure that each chapter, as I say, was as good as it could be. I think if you're going to write a book, then that, a couple of weeks of just totally focused work on it is key near the very end, because that will make or break your book. So that was a really big learning curve as well from the first book I did with Tony, and one that I've carried through with the other books I've written as well.
All right, last question. Do you have any favorite books about the writing process that you would recommend to other writers?
I do. For me, the one that stands out is On Writing Well by William Zinsser. I think that's how you pronounce it.
That's a great one.
It's so good. Listen, I only discovered it about 4 or 5 years ago, but it just distills so much practical writing advice in that book. There's like 10 or 12 key takeaways for me. And that's outstanding for anybody at any stage of their writing career. I would pick that up and inhale it, study that and read it from cover to cover, because there's so much in that.
Yeah. And it's not what a lot of people expect. I mean, sometimes you think, oh, a writing book, that's going to be grammar and spelling and word choice. And it's not that kind of book. It's more about the craft of writing and how you keep it simple and how you communicate well. It is fantastic.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely, it harks back to what I learned when I was reading newspapers as a teenager. The journalists, really good journalists, just get that. I love the simplicity and the minimalist style almost of some journalists, where I think I heard somebody say recently that sometimes when you're reading a really well-written piece, you're not really aware of the words so much as you're just absorbing the content. And I love that kind of notion where the writing is so simple and so pared back that you're almost not aware of it. And yeah, that's the style I aim for with my books as well.
Yeah, where you get into kind of a state of flow and it's just pure communication.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. It's pretty good. I mean, and William Zinsser talks about that. He says, cut out the clutter. The more you can cut clutter out of your writing, the better it will be. It's that classic Strunk and White, I think, instruction: omit needless words, and that's just probably the best advice for any writer ever. Is just go through your work and take out any words that don't add anything.
Great. Well, thanks so much for being with us here today, Rob. Where's the best place for people to find you if they want to reach out?
Yeah, Josh, my website is storybud.co. That's STORYBUD, storybud.co. And that's home to my business at the moment. And yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on, Rob. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
There's Josh. Go well.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to spread the word, please give us a 5-star rating review and tell your friends to subscribe too. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else you listen to podcasts. And if you're an entrepreneur interested in writing and publishing a nonfiction book to grow your business and make an impact, visit publishedauthor.com for show notes for this podcast and other free resources.